Hello, y'all. It's Miss Brett here. I am going to be taking y'all through our last block for this unit, which we are going to be focusing on the American economy. And so we use this phrase antebellum because this term antebellum basically means pre war, which is this phrase that's used to talk about the time before the Civil War. And so with the economy and with the Civil War kind of on the horizon and kind of in the back of our mind that it is coming. We're going to talk about the economy and how we definitely saw different divisions and different regions between the North, the South, and the West developing. And really, these structures have been in the United States from day one because of New England and their geography, they definitely relied more on manufactured goods. The South, because of their geography and their climate, relied on agriculture. And so we're going to see how the United States had this division happening based off of their economic regions. And so, kind of to think about how this unit has progressed so far, we talked about how the War of 1812 and the era of good feelings created this spark of nationalism in the United States, where we saw the United States really being this country that was developing, they were expanding. Yet, as expansion happened and the economies grew, it also caused divisions in this country. And so, we're really going to see how the War of 1812 and the era of good feelings really did promote this economic growth, this surge of nationalism that took place. And we're definitely going to see that the United States now is really pushing for more manufactured industrial goods. The Jeffersonian agrarian vision is really gone. And so the Republican Party that started with Jefferson has gone through dramatic changes. The War of 1812 totally caused the Republican Party to now be pro industry, pro nationalist, central power, federal government. And basically, the Republicans now are more like the old school Federalists that died, that went away. And a lot of that's because of the War of 1812. We see that political parties always change. They are constantly evolving. And so, yes, at this point in time in the 1820s, we are seeing the Republican Party pro national government, pro industry. And we will see, though, next unit how this is going to cause the rise of another party to come about. So, with today, we're going to focus on the economy and focus on how the economy is going to go through some divisions and also through some developments. So, with the economy, we definitely see it changing dramatically after the War of 1812, and that's because of many conditions that led to these changes. So, for one, without a doubt, we had major government policies that are going to support industrial growth. We've already talked about this with Henry Clay's American system. The fact that Henry Clay's American system is basically promoting industrial growth because of tariffs. Tariffs help the American business because more people will be inclined to buy American goods because they don't have that extra cost of the tariff. And so, if Americans are buying American goods, American businesses are definitely improving. And we also see this with the Bank of the United States. So, because the national government is actually supporting industry and manufactured goods, we are going to see this be a boost in the North. Okay, we'll talk about how the South feels about these policies. We also see a major change in population. Look at this chart over time, right? Where we see in the turn of the century in 1800, right, we have right around 5 million people total. But by the time we're getting through this era of good feelings, I mean, we're doubling and tripling the population. And a lot of that has to do with not only natural birth rates, but also immigration. We see a dramatic increase in immigrants at this time. And the main reason is because of economic opportunity. When there are jobs in the country, it brings immigrants in. And so, with our immigrant population, I mean, if you look at this, by 1850, 1860, we have a dramatic increase in our immigrant population. And so most of the immigrants that were coming over at this time were primarily Irish and German. And so whenever you talk about immigration, we always tend to talk about what we call push-pull factors. What's pushing immigrants out and what's pulling them in? Well, especially the Irish at this time, this is the famous Irish potato famine where we see Ireland struggling. And so that's going to push immigrants to leave, and obviously jobs and opportunity is going to pull them in. So the Irish and the Germans are definitely the two biggest population growths at this time. And so we definitely are seeing how this increase in immigration is going to cause a reaction that we call nativism. Now, nativism has nothing to do with Native Americans, like our tribal populations. Nativism is basically native born Americans who are anti immigrant. Nativists are people who believe that immigrants are going to steal jobs, that immigrants are going to threaten society. And we definitely see this rise whenever we have a rise of immigrants. Now, with nativism, you have to think about how, there's never been an American other than at this point in time, Native Americans, our tribes, that are actually true to America, right? Everyone else has come over through immigration. Our Puritans, our Pilgrims, the whole bringing over the Virginia Company, everyone has been brought here through immigration other than Native Americans at this point in time. So to claim, this nativist mentality, you have to think about your ancestors, right? How you were brought to this country. And so with this, it actually ended up developing so strong that it even turned into a third party called the Know Nothing Party. And the Know Nothing Party, again, this irony that they are Native Americans, the Know Nothing Party was just a third party, a minor party, where their only number one issue was anti-immigration, trying to limit immigration. And so these attitudes never go away. You can try and think today of how this is still very pretty apparent in politics. And we definitely see nativism always pop up whenever we have a surge of immigrants. So the last condition that really caused the economy to change dramatically is transportation. And we already talked a little bit about transportation, but just to kind of re-emphasize how this is affecting the economy, at this point in time, we definitely see a huge growth in roads and canals. Okay, we talked about the national road. Now, while the national government was not funding it, remember, Henry Clay's internal improvements got vetoed. It did not pass in his American system. But we do see states and private companies basically finding this important, the need to fund transportation. Now, if you look at this map, where most of our roads and most of our canals are up north. The north definitely was better connected. The transportation was much stronger because the North actually invested in it. And so we see the Northeast and the Northwest connecting. And we're going to start seeing railroads, but not much. Okay. It's definitely kind of the introduction of railroads by the 1830s. So we're getting there. Okay. So with that, the South definitely does not have good connections with transportation. So through government policies of tariffs, through increased population, we're going to have labor supply, through increased connections with transportation, the economy is definitely going to boom, it's going to grow. And for the most part, it's growing big time in the North with industry and the South with agriculture. Now, at this time, we end up having what we call the market revolution. And the market revolution is basically the name for the industrial revolution. With the market revolution, why it's called the market revolution is basically because we have a change in production. With the market revolution, before the market revolution, we end up seeing that the United States, people who produced stuff, if you produced shoes or shirts or watches or clocks or, even at this time, distilling liquor, this was a big industry. You produced it at your house. Your house was your private life and your public life. When people wanted to buy something, they came to your house. But we start to see with the market revolution the introduction of factories, where production now happens under one roof and people now go to work. This was a huge change in our economic life, a huge change in how we functioned. You now had a boss. You clocked in, you clocked out. Your lunch break was controlled. Before, when you worked out of your house, you woke up. When you felt like working, you produced. If you didn't feel like working as hard, you didn't produce. Now, with the market revolution, we are going to see the factory system being created, and we're going to definitely see the changes of our economic livelihood. And so the market revolution, again, now instead of going to someone's house to buy the goods, you're actually going to the market. You're buying them like at a store. And so the market revolution dramatically changes how production is done in the United States. So we're going to watch John Green. This is one of my favorite John Green videos. I think he does a remarkable job explaining the market revolution. And so we're going to watch this and kind of to understand the impact the market revolution had on the United States.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we return to one of my favorite subjects, economics.
Mr. Green, I don't want to brag, but economics is actually my best subject. Like, I got the bronze medal at the state academic decathlon tournament among C students.
Yeah, I remember me from the past. By the way, thanks for getting that picture into our show. It just goes to show you aptitude is not destiny. Anyway, economics is about much more than like supply and demand curves. Ultimately, it's about the decisions people make and how those decisions shape their lives and the world. So today we're going to turn to one of the least studied but most interesting periods in American history, the market revolution. There weren't any fancy wars or politically charged debates, but this discussion shaped the way that most Americans actually live their lives and think about work on a daily basis. Like, if you or someone you know goes to work, well, then you have the market revolution to thank, or possibly to curse. The market revolution, like the Industrial Revolution, was more of a process than an event. It happened in the first half of the 19th century, basically the period before the Civil War. This was the so-called era of good feelings, because between 1812 and 1836, there was really only one political party, making American politics, much less contentious, also more boring. The market revolution saw many Americans move away from producing stuff largely for themselves on independent farms, that Jeffersonian ideal, and toward producing goods for sale to others, often others who were very far away, with prices set by competition with other producers. This was closer to Hamilton's American dream. In the end, buddy, you didn't get to be president, but you did win. In many ways, this was the beginning of the modern commercial industrial economy, not just in the United States, but in the world. The first thing that enabled this massive economic shift was new technology, specifically in transportation and communication. Like in the 18th century, it was very difficult to bring goods to markets, and that meant that markets were local and small. Most trade was overland, and transporting goods 30 miles overland in the United States literally cost as much as shipping them to England. So to get something from Cincinnati to New York, for instance, the most efficient way was to go down the Mississippi River, through the Gulf of Mexico, around Florida, and then up the Atlantic coast, which took 3 months. But that was still less time and less money than more direct overland routes. But new transportation changed this. First came better roads, which were largely financed by tolls. Even the federal government got in on the act, building the so-called National Road, which reached all the way from the massive city of Cumberland, Maryland, across our great nation to the equally metropolitan Wheeling, West Virginia.
Mr. Green.
I know me from the past. West Virginia did not yet exist. Shut up! More important than roads were canals, which made transport much cheaper and more efficient, and which wouldn't have been possible without the steamboat. Robert Fulton's steamboat Claremont first sailed from New York to Albany in 1807, demonstrating the potential of steam-powered commerce, and by 1811, there were steamboats on the Mississippi. The introduction of steamboats set off a mania for canal building between 1800 and the Depression of 1837, which put a halt to most construction. construction, more than 3,000 miles of canals were built. And no state was more instrumental in the canal boom than New York, which in 1825 completed the 363-mile-long Erie Canal linking the Great Lakes with the Hudson River, which made New York the nation's premier port. Other cities like Buffalo, Rochester, and Syracuse grew up along the canal, so much so that Nathaniel Hawthorne once said that canal is like fertilizer, causing cities to spring up alongside it. That's such a good simile, Nathaniel Hawthorne. It's almost like the United States didn't have any good writers until Mark Twain, but we need to read somebody from the early 19th century, so I guess it's you. But from a long-term perspective, the most important new transportation? Railroads. The first commercial railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio, was begun in 1828, and by 1860 there were more than 30,000 miles of rails in the United States. And on the communication side, we got the telegraph, so no longer would Andrew Jackson fight battles 2 weeks after the end of a war. Telegraphs allowed merchants to know when to expect their shipments and how much they could expect to sell them for, and then, as now, more information meant more robust markets. But perhaps the most important innovation of the time was the factory. Now, when you think of factories, you might think of like Chinese political prisoners making smartphones, but early factories looked like this. More than just a technological development, the factory was an organizational innovation. Like, factories gathered workers together in one place and split up tasks among them, making production much faster and also more efficient. The first factories relied on water power, which is the reason they were all east of the fall line, the geographic reason why there are so many waterfalls and rapids on the East Coast. But after 1840, steam power was introduced, so factories could be located in other places, especially near the large cities that were sprouting up in what we now know as the Midwest. So the American system of manufacture, which centered on mass production of interchangeable parts, grew up primarily in New England, but then it moved to the Midwest, where it spent its adolescence and its adulthood, and now its tottering decline into senility. So all these new economic features, roads, canals, railroads, telegraphs, factories, they all required massive upfront capital investment. Like, you just can't build a canal in stages as it pays for itself. So without more modern banking systems and people willing to take risks, none of this would have happened. Some of these investments were facilitated by new business organizations, especially the Limited Liability Corporation, which enabled investors to finance business ventures without being personally responsible for losses other than their own. In other words, corporations can fail without, like, ruining their stockholders and directors. People don't always like that, by the way, but it's been very good for economic growth in the last 180 years or so. So having angered a bunch of people by talking about the important role that big businesses played in growing the American economy in the 19th century, I will now anger the rest of you by talking about the important role that the state played. In the 1830s, states began passing general incorporation laws, which made it easier to create corporations, and the Supreme Court upheld them and protected them from further interference in cases like Gibbons versus Ogden, which struck down a monopoly that New York had granted to one steamboat company, and the Charles River Bridge case, which said that building a second bridge over the Charles River did not infringe upon the charter of the first bridge. In both those cases, the court was using its power to encourage competition. And this brings up something really important about the growth of American capitalism. Government helped. The federal government built roads and canals and its highest court protected businesses, and states issued bonds to build canals and offered sweetheart deals to companies that built railroads. And despite what we may believe about the heroic risk-taking entrepreneurs building the American economy through solitary efforts, without the government protecting their interests, they wouldn't have been able to do much. All right, let's go to the thought bubble. The market revolution changed the landscape of work, which for most of the prior 200 years happened at home. Small-scale production of clothes and other goods had been done in the home, largely by women, and initially, this is how industrial production worked as well. Factory owners would produce some of the products, like patterns for shoes, and then farm the finishing out to people working in their houses. Eventually, they realized that it would be more efficient to gather the workers together in one place. Although the older putting out system continued in some industries, especially in big cities, after the market revolution, more and more Americans went to work instead of working from home. The market revolution also changed the way we imagined work and leisure time. Like, on farms, the seasons and hours of daylight regulated the time for work, but in factories, work is regulated by the clock, which, by the way, was one of the first products to be manufactured using the American system of manufacturing. Railroads and shipping timetables further required the standardization of time. Factories also made it possible for more people to do industrial work. At first, this meant women. The workers in the early textile mills at Lowell, Massachusetts, for instance, were primarily young New England farm girls who worked for a few years in the mills before returning home to get married. Women were cheaper to employ because it was assumed that they would not be a family's sole breadwinner. At least this was the excuse for not paying them more more at the time. I can't remember what excuse we have now, but I'm sure it's a great one. Anyway, all of this meant that the nature of work had changed. In colonial America, artisans worked for what they called their price, which was linked to what they produced. In a factory, however, workers were paid a wage according to the number of hours they worked, regardless of how much they produced. This may not sound like a big deal, but working for wages with one's livelihood defined by a clock and the whims of an employer was a huge change, and it undermined the idea of freedom that was supposedly the basis of America. Thomas Jefferson had worried that men working in factories dependent upon their employers were inherently unfree, and that this would make them unfit to be proper American citizens. And as it happens, many factory workers agreed with him. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So one reaction to the restrictions of the wage worker was to engage in the great American pastime of lighting out for the territories. With less and less farmland available in New England, young men had been migrating west for decades, and after the War of 1812, this flood of migration continued and even grew. Between 1790 and 1840, 4.5 million people crossed over the Appalachian Mountains, and 6 new states were created between 1815 and 1821. Ohio's population grew from 231,000 in 1810 to over 2 million by 1850. People even took up the motto, "Malaria isn't going to catch itself," and moved to Florida after we purchased it from Spain in 1819. Moving out west was a key aspect of American freedom, and the first half of the 19th century became the age of manifest destiny, the idea that it was a God-given right of Americans to spread out over the North American continent. The term was coined by a New York journalist, John L. O'Sullivan, who wrote that the people living out west, i.e. the Native Americans, must succumb to, quote, "our manifest destiny to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent which Providence has given us for the development of the great experiment in liberty." Stan, he actually wrote overspread. One thing I love about Providence is it has like a 100% rate of give a thing unto us and take a thing away from them. One of the results of this migration was that it was really difficult for factory owners to find men who could work in their factories. First, they looked to Yankee women to fill the factories, but increasingly, those jobs were filled by immigrants. Fortunately, the U.S. had lots of immigrants, like the more than 1 million Irish people who came here fleeing poverty, especially after the potato famine of 1845 to 1851. Lastly, let's turn to the intellectual responses to the market revolution. Oh, it's time for the mystery document?
All right, so we're going to stop there just because with the actual the rest of this video, it actually is going to be going into next unit, because since we divided unit 4 into A and B, it actually does go into next unit. So I don't want us to get ahead of ourselves, and I don't want to give you too much content that obviously we're going to cover later. So I like that John Green video specifically because he does a good job of really showing how we went from working at home to working in factories, and how the factory system drew in immigrants, and how we definitely are going to start seeing the divided regions in the country. So let's talk about this division and how we definitely see 3 very distinct regions in the United States as far as the economy goes. So without a doubt, the Northeast is industrial. The Northeast has pretty much been industrial from day one, with where we had rum distilleries. It's where we had the fishing market. It's where we had other industries other than agriculture. Agriculture really does not thrive up in the Northeast because of the climate. And so with the industrial Northeast, we definitely are starting to see major technological advancements that help this industry grow and really help with that factory system. The factory system for sure is going to be the norm. It's pretty much how most people worked up in the Northeast. And the first big factories that started in this country were for textiles. Textiles is clothing. And we're going to talk about how that has a relationship with the South. With the textile factories up in the Northeast, we are seeing them just expand pretty much in every big city. There was a textile factory. And so with that being said, definitely want to give a shout out to Mr. Eli Whitney, because Eli Whitney, yes, we're going to talk about him in a second for the South, but most importantly, Eli Whitney started what we call interchangeable parts. And with Eli Whitney's interchangeable parts, we see factories really producing and keeping the parts the same so that they can mass produce quicker. So with the Northeast being industrial, being factories, this is where we definitely see our labor and our immigrants coming in because of the fact that there were job opportunities. So, like John Green mentioned, we definitely saw the Lowell system. The Lowell system recruited workers, specifically young women. And the Lowell system, when they recruited young women, we're talking like 15, 16, 17 years old, worked, saved some money, and then usually moved back home and got married. And the Lowell system was a pretty interesting work setup because they lived there, they worked there. Very little freedom to themselves, but it definitely shows the labor supply that we see. And like we said, immigrants as well coming in and filling these jobs too. Now, an interesting thing that happens with the fact that we now have factory systems is now we are going to see labor unions actually start. Because you used to work from home, you were your boss, you worked when you wanted to work, you took breaks when you wanted to take breaks. Now we're working in a factory where we have a boss, we have wages, we have these setups that cause frustrations. And so labor unions are actually going to start becoming very popular in the Northeast and kind of demanding better conditions, better pay, and so forth. And it's interesting because still to this day, the Northeast is where labor unions thrive. While they're not going to get too much done at this time, this is when we see labor unions start. And we actually even saw this go to the Supreme Court, where basically trying to outlaw labor unions. However, with the court case versus Hunt, Commonwealth versus Hunt ruled that peaceful unions can negotiate labor contracts, and peaceful unions can negotiate labor contracts with their employers for better pay and so forth. So the national government supported and upheld the legality of labor unions. So the industrial Northeast, no textile factories, no immigrants, lots of job opportunities. We see labor unions popping up and so forth. So when we look at the Northwest, and we can see the spread out when we talked about how the Northwest is, as people are moving, what basically develops is agriculture. And with agriculture, it's primarily food. This is where we get lots of cultivation of corn and wheat and potatoes and lots of food out in the Northwest. And obviously, we also have technological advancements here as well with John Deere and the fact that we now have plows, we have technological innovations to actually help with production of the agricultural Northwest. And in the agricultural Northwest, we also see not a lot, let me take that back, but we do see immigrants moving out to the Northwest to farm and looking for opportunities. Most immigrants stayed in the industrial Northeast to take factory jobs, but we do start seeing immigrants spreading out to the Northwest. Immigrants, for the most part, did avoid the South because the South was kind of its own little identity. So, with the South, let's talk about how the South basically is completely dominated by cotton. The South, yes, when it started, there are some regions still that are producing tobacco and producing rice, but cotton becomes the number one desired good. And this is a lot because there's high demand for cotton with textile factories, not only in the US, but also in Great Britain. And cotton, we even had politicians claim that cotton is king. And we got this mentality that if you grew cotton, right, like cotton was the number one profitable good, you were like a king, like you were royalty. It made money. It made so much money. And if you look at this over time, from 1800 to 1860, how cotton literally ended up becoming more than half of the US exports. The South was filthy rich with cotton production. We definitely see the South and King Cotton becoming this identity. It was something that was instilled in the South and definitely seen as this royal component. Now, obviously, if you're going to have this production of cotton in the South, we cannot ignore the fact that it was done by slave labor. And the increase in slavery the population of slavery grew tremendously. Now, I need to point out that in 1808, the U.S. banned the slave trade. The U.S. banned the international slave trade. So in 1808, the U.S. is no longer importing slaves. But look at the population, okay? The blue chart or bar is the number of slaves, right? And also then the green is the cotton production. With the slave population increasing this much without importing slaves, obviously this is by forced reproduction. Slave women were forced to reproduce since the laws that if you are born to a slave woman, you are born a slave. And also, we see that the spreading out of slavery, this is going to end up causing so many families to be torn apart, where slaves were sold west and slaves were sold to different plantations. As the South spread out west and found more fertile land and cotton became the number one good, the slave life also is going to be impacted by this. Now, with Eli Whitney, when Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, Eli Whitney actually was trying to invent something to alleviate the slave labor. As slaves harvested cotton, they also met mostly women, elderly, would de-seed the cotton, which was a very tedious task, but you had to take the seeds out of the cotton. And Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin thinking this would alleviate that tedious task. But now, because the cotton can be de-seeded faster, there was higher demand to cultivate faster and to harvest faster. And it definitely did end up backfiring on the slave population because now the demand to work faster was growing. And so I just want to show you this map. Well, let me finish up with the relationship of the North before we look at this map. So the North and the South had this very interesting relationship, kind of a reciprocal relationship, where the North relied on the South for the cotton. And the North always liked to play this kind of holier than thou mentality, like we don't have slaves, we don't support slavery, but they did. The North totally turned a blind eye to the fact that they were profiting from cotton produced by slaves. Okay. Yeah, the North didn't have slaves, but the North relied on slaves for the cotton production. But then the South relied on the North to buy their cotton, but also relied on the North because the South literally did not produce anything. Like they had no manufactured goods. They had no other industries. Because cotton was so profitable, the South never wanted to try to expand and diversify their economy because of the profit from cotton. So the South is going to rely on the North for manufactured goods. And this is why the South hated tariffs, because the South was basically frustrated that manufactured goods, their prices kept going up. Yet no one was in the national government was helping prices with cotton. So to show you the dramatic effects of how cotton production in the United States is going to completely alter the social life with the slave population, okay? The yellow spots are where cotton is produced. And this is in 1820, right at the start of the market revolution. The pink dots, each pink dot represents 200 slaves, okay? So one pink dot is 200 slaves. That's a large plantation, okay? Most plantations, we're talking between 50 to 100 slaves. And you can see there are areas in 1820 where you can't even distinguish the dots, right? Now let's look at how this changes in 1860. The dramatic growth of producing cotton caused a dramatic growth in forced reproduction of the slave population. And we see how cotton production is going to dominate. Now, with that being said, we end up seeing with the slave population being forced to work harder, work faster, and now also families being torn apart as cotton production spread out west. So this creates a very interesting, unique situation in the South where the population is pretty rigid. So looking at this population chart, okay, we have so many charts today to really show the impact of how the slave population, I mean, without a doubt, the slave population is the driving force of the American economy. The slave population is producing cotton, making the South filthy rich. They're producing cotton to really help the northern factories produce textiles, making them filthy rich. If it wasn't for the slave population, the national economy, I mean, what would the national economy be, right? And so when you look at this chart, this green color represents the white population, and the blue color represents the slave population. And yes, there are free blacks. Okay, people think at this time every black person in the country is a slave. That's not true. There's many free blacks up north, but there are free blacks also in the South. But look at states like Mississippi. There's more slaves than white people. Same in South Carolina. And so there's definitely as the population of the slave population grows, there's also this fear from the white population of uprisings and so forth. And so with the slave population and growing, it ends up creating a social class in the South that is very, very strict. So to finish today, just to kind of show you the distinctions of the South, it's so different from the North because the North was pretty mixed between rich and poor. You didn't really see divisions in society. You couldn't really look at someone and assume their wealth or their status. And we definitely saw so much diversity in the North. There were so many different groups in the North between immigrants, between free blacks, between different groups coming in. But in the South, it was like a hierarchy. It was basically like a system where you could literally see someone and know exactly where they fall in the social class. So the planter class is the plantation owners, like these plantation style homes that we still call plantation style homes, which gets a lot of discussion today, where we have this group, the owners of plantations that are these wealthy, very high up, very rich people, and almost kind of like people compared it to like feudalism, right? We all remember feudalism from world history, where you have the lord at the top and all the workers at the bottom working for the lord at the top. It was kind of like that on a plantation, where you had the plantation owners and then you had the slave population working for the elite class. And a lot of these planter class, a lot of these elites who owned plantations were also congressmen, and they were big politicians and mayors and governors. And so they're driving policy that supports the slave system. They're driving policy that supports this racial economic labor force. And so remember from day one when we talked about the creation of race, right? Racist attitudes aren't created out of nowhere. Racist policies end up promoting and creating racist attitudes. And so we definitely see with this plantation class, this elite class separate from the rest. Then we kind of have the middle class, which we would call the yeoman farmer. Yeoman farmers were basically, they had small plots of land. They made well for themselves. They weren't like super wealthy or anything. And sometimes yeoman farmers could possibly afford to have a slave. But yeoman farmers either worked their own or they had like one or two slaves to help with them. And in that situation, and I'm not justifying slavery by any means here, but normally when yeoman farmers had a slave to help them, the yeoman farmer and the slave worked together. It was a partnership. It was definitely seen as a more, it was more of a respectable relationship rather than living on a plantation where you are one of 100 slaves, and the relationship between the master and the slaves was very, very, very tense and most of the time very negative. So yeoman farmers, kind of like your middle class farmers, your middle class workers who once in a while could afford to have working hands to help with possibly having slaves, but not often, okay? And then we get this group, which we call the plain folk. These people tended to be nicknamed white trash. They tended to be nicknamed crackers. This is our lowest class of white population that tended to be out in the Appalachian Mountains, the backcountry. And we definitely see that with the plain folk, these poor white people, very little economic opportunity. They didn't have the ability to own land, and they didn't have the ability to get jobs because most people, again, in the South used slave labor. They didn't pay wages for labor. Now, the ironic part is the plain folk tended to support slavery mainly because of race. They saw themselves as at least one step higher on the social class. And with that, if they actually had some forms of education and realized if slavery didn't exist, there would actually be more job opportunities for them. But again, because of racial discrimination, the plain folk saw themselves as at least not at the bottom of the pyramid, which leaves us with the slave population. And the slave population was big. Definitely in some states, like I showed you, some states had the slave population was the biggest. And so I like to show you this chart to kind of show you the distinguished groups of people in the South compared to how many slaves they own, because your ownership of how many slaves you had definitely distinguished which class you were in. So if you see this, let me move the video. This tiny little pie chart is the group, the planter class, that owned 50 or more slaves. This tiny, tiny section is your plantation owners, okay, where they owned 50 or more slaves. Then we definitely see the larger groups, kind of like your yeoman farmers, owning smaller groups of slaves, having less slaves, smaller plots of land as well. But notice the biggest chart, the biggest pie piece, did not own slaves at all. Okay, most people, and we're talking, if we're saying 1 to 4 slaves, like we're talking most people in the South really did not have slaves. Or if they did, it was just a couple. And so this planter class is elite, it is high up, it is small, but they are the ones in charge. They are the ones driving the government in the South and so forth. So with today, just to finish up, showing you this plantation of how things really worked in the South and how we definitely see that agriculture, without a doubt, is down in the South, right? Cotton is king. Factories are up in the Northeast producing textiles. And then as expansion is happening out west, we also see agriculture spreading. So yes, this nation at this point in time seems pretty connected, seems very nationalist, very proud, very just kind of this idea that they have the ability to expand and that they're growing and they're becoming more powerful. But as expansion continued, division also is going to transpire. And so the economy, without a doubt, is very rigid between the regions, and it caused very different social classes as well. So that finishes us up for this unit. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Otherwise, thank y'all for listening.